The August Revolution, also known as the August General Uprising, was a revolution launched by the Viet Minh against French colonial rule in Vietnam on August 14, 1945. Within 2 weeks, forces under the Viet Minh had seized control of most rural villages and cities throughout the North, Center and South Vietnam, including Hanoi, where President Ho Chi Minh announced the formation of the Provisional Democratic Republic, Saigon, exception in townships Móng Cái, Vĩnh Yên, Giang, Lào Cai, Lai Châu. However, according to Vietnamese document, Viet Minh, in fact, seized control of Vietnam. On September 2, 1945, Ho declared Vietnamese independence. The August Revolution created a uniform government for the entire country. Historical background: French colonialism, French colonial rule. Before the Japanese arrived, French colonialism in Vietnam had already lasted 87 years. By 1897 the French had created the Federation of Indochina, an artificial unit linking a Vietnam now broken for convenience into 3 separately ruled territories with newly acquired Cambodia and Laos. To justify their imperial domination, French claimed that it was their responsibility to help undeveloped regions in Asia become civilized. Without French intervention, these places would remain backward, uncivilized and impoverished. However, in reality, French imperialism was driven by the demand for resources, raw materials and cheap labor. It is generally agreed that French colonial rule was politically repressive and economically exploitative. Since the French occupation of Vietnam, thousands of poorly armed Vietnamese, as they always had, reacted to foreign control with various rebellions. One of the famous rebellions, called CN Vong Movement, which was a large-scale Vietnamese insurgency between 1885 and 1889 against French colonial rule. In 1917, an eclectic band of political prisoners, common criminals and mutinous prison guards seized the Thanh Nguyen Penitentiary, the largest penal institution in northern Tonkin. The extraordinary regional and social diversity of its force makes the Thanh Nguyen Uprising a compelling prequel to the modern nationalist movements of the 1930s. Although all these rebellions finally failed, the rebels remained a powerful symbol of resistance for generations. Development of nationalist movements during the colonial period. The French did transform Vietnamese society. Education and national industry were promoted, which had the unintended effect of stimulating the development of nationalist movements. In the North, the anti-colonial nationalist movement was dominated by communism since Ho Chi Minh created the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League in 1925. On February 3, 1930, a special conference was held in Hong Kong under the chairmanship of Ho Chi Minh. Out of this conference the Vietnamese Communist Party was born. In October, following a Comintern directive, this name was changed to Indochinese Communist Party, or in short, ICP, until the party was officially disbanded by Ho Chi Minh in November 1945. It held a leading position in the Vietnamese anti-colonial revolution. In the South, the anti-colonial nationalist movement is more complicated than the North. The Cao Tai was the first of southern Vietnam's 3 most influential politico-religious organizations to emerge in the colonial era. Officially founded by colonial civil servant Ngo Van Q in 1926, it would grow to be the largest of the region's politically oriented religious entities, and in many ways the most powerful. More than a decade later, in 1939, Prophet Thanh Phu So introduced another politico-religious organization into southern Vietnam's anti-colonial milieu by founding the Hoa, How? By performing alleged miracle cures, preaching, and carrying out acts of extreme charity for the poor. By the end of 1939, Prophet Fusi had already attracted tens of thousands of adherents to the new Hoa organization. The third politico-religious organization, called Bin Zuyen, can be traced back to the early 1920s, but Bin Zuyen didn't become a truly organized political force until the end of the Second World War. All three of these organizations consisted of major anti-colonial powers in southern Vietnam, World War II and the Japanese occupation. The Japanese occupation and the March 9, 1945 coup. Before 1945, French and Japanese had uneasily ruled Vietnam together for over 4 years. In September 1940, just months after France capitulated to Germany, Japanese troops took advantage of French weakness to station troops in northern Vietnam on the purpose of cutting off the supply route to the southern flank of the China Theater. From 1940 to March 1945, the French retained their administrative responsibilities, police duties, and even their colonial army, in exchange for allowing Japanese troops and material to pass through Indochina. By 1943, however, there were signs that the Japanese might lose the war. The United States began the island-hopping sweep through the South Pacific, a seaborne Allied landing in Indochina, and an overland attack from China became real threats to the Japanese. In addition, an upsurge of Gaullist sentiment in Indochina after Charles de Gaulle returned to Paris at the head of the French Provisional Government in September 1944 added to Japanese concerns. In the evening of March 9, 1945, the Japanese forces attacked the French in every center and removed the French from administrative control of Indochina. In less than 24 hours, the major part of the French armed forces throughout Indochina was put out of combat. The entire French colonial system, which had been in existence for almost 87 years, came tumbling down. Practically all French civil and military leaders were made prisoners, including Admiral Decoux, after the Japanese removed the French from administrative control in Indochina. They made no attempt to impose their own direct control of the civilian administration, primarily concerned with the defense of Vietnam against an Allied invasion. The Japanese were not interested in Vietnamese politics. However, they also understood the desirability of a certain degree of administrative continuity. It was to their advantage to install a Vietnamese government that would acquiesce in the Japanese military presence. With this in mind, the Japanese persuaded the Vietnamese Emperor, Bao Tai, to cooperate with Japan and to declare Vietnam independent of France. On March 11, 1945, Bao Tai did just that by abrogating the Franco-Vietnamese Treaty of Protectorate of 1883. Vietnam's new independence, however, rested on the government's willingness to cooperate with Japan and accept the Japanese military presence, an opportunity for Vietnamese nationalists. From March until August 1945, Vietnam enjoyed what was called a fake independence. In the aftermath of the coup, the Japanese most definitely wanted to minimize internal change in Indochina, changes which would have adversely affected the military objectives. The Tren Trong Kim cabinet, from all evidence available, was only a government in name and ruled over no state in fact. The affairs of Indochinese were still in the hands of the Japanese. If the March 9 coup was a disaster for the French, it was an opportunity for Vietnamese nationalists. In fact, it marked a turning point in the Vietnamese Revolution. Freed from French repression, which had continued unabated in the early phase of the Japanese occupation, Vietnamese revolutionaries had much greater freedom of movement. In May 1941, Ho Chi Minh formed the Vietnam.Lap Dong Minh, or Viet Minh for short, At the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party at Pac Bo in northern Vietnam, Viet Minh encouraged the creation of national salvation associations, and adopted guerrilla warfare as the cornerstone of its revolutionary strategy. After the coup, the Japanese were content to control the large cities and leave the countryside to the Vietnamese. The Viet Minh in particular took advantage of this situation to strengthen the power. During the 5 months of the Japanese interlude, to prepare for the anticipated popular insurrection, the Viet Minh carried out propaganda activities and organizational work in the Vietnamese countryside. However, the Viet Minh was not the only political organization to anticipate an opportunity. In fact, after the brief storm of bullets of March 9, political parties, groups and associations were formed throughout Vietnam. In the south, because of the weak status of the communist movement, the Viet Minh failed to take the leadership of the movements during the preparation for insurrection. Several politico-religious organizations mentioned above expanded the power rapidly. In early summer 1945, Hoe Hao leaders opened talks with the heads of other southern nationalist groups in the south, including the Cao Tai, the Trotskyites, to fight for and defend an independent Vietnam when the war drew to a close. The blasting fuse, devastating famine. The famine of 1944–45 was another issue of utmost importance during the Japanese interlude. The famine resulted from both man-made and natural disaster. During the war, the Japanese had forced many rice farmers to grow other crops. As a result, rice production decreased, especially in the north, where crops had often been supplemented in the past by shipments from the south. Now, however, Japanese troops consumed the surplus from the south and converted it to fuel for military vehicles. Terrible flooding in the spring of 1945 added to the misery. Starving peasants flocked to the cities or died passively in the countryside. This devastation contributed to the crisis of authority in the country. Neither the French nor the Japanese took effective measures to alleviate the famine, and Kim's government could do nothing without Japanese consent. The misery and anger combined to foster a new interest in politics, especially among the younger generation, which the Viet Minh turned to its advantage. During the famine, the Viet Minh conducted raids on Japanese granaries and the rice storage facilities of Vietnamese landlords. In the long run, this action won the Viet Minh increased popular support. It highlighted the impotency of Kim's government and intensified popular feelings against the French and Japanese. The Viet Minh succeeded in creating People's Revolutionary Committees all over the north. These committees were to take over local administration when the Viet Minh launched the general insurrection. The August Revolution in the north. When the Japanese surrendered on August 15, the Viet Minh immediately launched the insurrection, which they had already prepared for a long time. People's Revolutionary Committees across the countryside took over administrative positions, often acting on their own initiative, while in the cities the Japanese stood by as the Vietnamese took control. On the morning of August 19, the Viet Minh took control of Hanoi, seizing the northern Vietnam in the next few days. Tran Trong Kim's government had resigned earlier on August 13, yielding to Ho Chi Minh's new Vietnamese provisional government. Ho Chi Minh offered Ba Thai a position as supreme advisor. Ho Chi Minh declared independence for the newly established Democratic Republic of Vietnam, headquartered in Hanoi, on September 2, 1945. revolution in the south. However, when the people celebrated the victory in the north, the Viet Minh faced various problems in the southern part of the country. The south was politically more diverse than the north, and the Viet Minh had been unable to establish the same degree of control there as they had achieved in the north. There were serious divisions in the independence movement in the south, where the Viet Minh, Cao Tai Hoa, Trotskyites and other nationalist groups competed for control. On August 25, the Communists established a Provisional Executive Committee with Tran Van Giau at its head. The committee took over public administration in Saigon, but followed Allied orders that the Japanese maintain law and order until Allied troops arrive. Aftermath: the Allies' occupation and consolidation of Viet Minh. Just as Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had begun to extend drive control to all of Vietnam, the attention of his new government was shifting from internal matters to the arrival of Allied troops. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Allies divided Indochina into two zones at the 16th parallel, attaching the southern zone to the Southeast Asia Command and leaving the northern part to Chiang Kai-shek's China, to accept the surrender of the Japanese. The occupation period proved to be a great challenge for Ho Chi Minh and the ICP. When British forces from the Southeast Asia Command arrived in Saigon on September 13, they also brought with them a detachment of French troops. Thanks to the acquiescence of British occupation forces in the south, and French were able to move rapidly to reassert control over the southern half of the country, where its economic interests were strongest. Drive authority was weakest, and colonial forces were most deeply entrenched. However, in the north, occupation period became critical opportunity for the Viet Minh to consolidate and triumph over domestic rivals. On August 20, Chiang Kai-shek gave orders for the Chinese First Front Army, under the command of General Lu Han of Yunnan, to cross into Vietnam to accept the surrender of the Japanese 38th Army. The Chinese, unlike the British in the south, refused to prepare the way for an immediate French return, and in order to maintain order in Hanoi and keep the city functioning, they allowed the Vietnamese provisional government to remain in control with this breathing space. Ho Chi Minh was able to maneuver against and eventually eliminate his domestic rivals, thus strengthening Viet Minh control over northern Vietnamese politics. The March 6 Franco-Vietnamese Accord. As southern Vietnam's disunited resistance forces struggled to push back French advances, Ho Chi Minh and the Drive started to negotiate with France in hopes of preserving national independence while avoiding war. In March 1946, the two sides reached a preliminary accord. Instead of obtaining French recognition of Vietnamese independence, Ho Chi Minh agreed to his government being weakly identified as a free state within the Indo-Chinese Federation under the French Union. For their part, the French agreed to two provisions they had no intention of honoring. French troops came to north of the 16th parallel were limited to 15,000 men for a period of 5 years, and a referendum was to be held on the issue of unifying the Vietnamese regions. This agreement entangled the French and Vietnamese in joint military operations and fruitless negotiations for several months. However, the status of southern Vietnam remained the sticking point. The March Accord, which called for a referendum to determine whether the South would rejoin the rest of the country or remain a separate French territory, left the fate of former Cochinchina in flux. First Indochina War. The preliminary accord was but the first step toward an intended overall and lasting agreement. Southern Vietnam's future political status had to be negotiated. From June to September 1946, Ho Chi Minh met with French representatives in Vietnam and France to discuss this and other issues. Unfortunately, almost immediately after the signing of the March 6 Accord, relations began to deteriorate. Negotiations, first at Dalar and later at Fontainebleau, broke down over the issue of the fate of southern Vietnam. As talking failed to bring results, both sides began to prepare for a military solution. Provocations by both French and Vietnamese troops led to the outbreak of full-scale guerrilla war on December 19, 1946. Nearly 1 year after the August Revolution, Vietnam and France were at war. Works cited: William J. Diker, Vietnam Nationing Revolution, Westview Press, Frederick A. Prager, ISBN 0865313369. K. W. Taylor, A History of the Vietnamese. The Edinburgh Building, Cambridge CB28RU, UK, Cambridge University Press. ISBN 978-0521875868. Peter Worthing, Occupation and Revolution, China and the Vietnamese August Revolution of 1945. Institution of East Asian Studies, University of California, Berkeley, California 94720-2318. Institution of East Asian Studies, University of California, Berkeley. ISBN 1-55729-072-5. Stein, Ton Essen, Vietnam 1946. How the War Began. University of California Press, Berkeley and Los Angeles, California. University of California Press. ISBN 9780520944602. Jessica M. Chapman. Cauldron of Resistance, Godin DM, The United States, and 1950s Southern Vietnam, Cornell University Press, Sage House, 512 East State Street, Ithaca, New York 14850, Cornell University Press. ISBN 978-08014-50617. Craig A. Lockhart, Southeast Asia World History. 198 Madison Avenue, New York 10016, Oxford University Press. ISBN 978-019-516075-8. Robert Chaplin, The Lost Revolution, Vietnam 1945–1965. The Trinity Press, Worcester and London. The Trinity Press. William J. Diker, The Communist Road to Power in Vietnam. 2465 Central Avenue, Suite 200 Boulder, CO 80301, Westview Press. ISBN 0891587942. David G. Ma, Vietnam 1945, The Quest for Power. Berkeley and AMP, Los Angeles, California, University of California Press. ISBN 0520078330. Hein, Kim Khan, Vietnamese August Revolution Reinterpreted, Journal of Asian Studies 34. pp. 761-82. Peter Zinomin, Colonial Prisons and Anti-Colonial Resistance in French Indochina, The Time When Rebellion, 1917. Modern Asian Studies, Volume 34, No. 1. pp. 57-98. William J. Diker, Ho Chi Minh, A Life. John T. McAllister, Jr., Vietnam, The Origins of Revolution. Archimedes L. A. Patti, Why Vietnam? Prelude to America's Albatross.